The morning sun struggled to penetrate the dense smog that hung over the worn streets of Eastside Grove. A neighborhood forgotten by time and progress. Amid crumbling buildings with faded graffiti and the distant hum of passing trains. Michael Evans, a 14-year-old boy with determined hazel eyes, was already hard at work. His alarm had gone off at 5 a.m., a routine he knew by heart. But his tired body and growling stomach reminded him of the burdens he carried. Michael's sneakers, frayed at the edges, slapped against the cracked pavement as he maneuvered his rusted bicycle down the street. The bag of newspapers strapped to his side bounced heavily with every bump in the road. He had learned to ignore the sharp jolts of pain in his shoulders. There was no room for complaints when his family depended on him. At home, his mother, Sarah Evans, was likely already at her second job cleaning offices downtown. Her shifts were long, her pay inadequate, but she never let her children see her cry. Michael had caught her once, though, late at night when she thought he and his sister were asleep. The weight of unpaid bills and a refrigerator that rarely had more than a carton of milk or a few eggs was too much for her to bear alone. His younger sister, Emily, was just 9 but carried a quiet wisdom that far exceeded her years. She was bright and full of potential, but her chronic asthma had led to countless hospital visits the family could barely afford. Michael often stayed up late after work, poring over online medical articles, trying to find remedies that wouldn't drain their savings further. The neighborhood was more than just home, it was a constant reminder of the inequality that defined their lives. Across town, shiny high-rises loomed over luxury boutiques and pristine parks. Yet, in Eastside Grove, garbage lined the streets, and children played in abandoned lots, their laughter muffled by the sound of sirens. Michael had learned early that the world wasn't fair. At school, he endured subtle jabs from classmates who never missed a chance to remind him of what he didn't have. "Hey, Evans," one boy had sneered last week. "Your dad forget to buy you new shoes again?" Michael didn't respond, he couldn't. His father had walked out on the family years ago, leaving Sarah to pick up the pieces. The absence hurt, but Michael had vowed to fill the gap in his family the best he could that morning. As Michael tossed newspapers onto porches, his mind wandered. Rent was due in a week, and Sarah had mentioned that they were still short. He was considering asking his employer, Mr. Grayson, for an advance, even though the man had a reputation for being stingy. Michael knew the answer would likely be no, but desperation pushed him to try. As he turned the corner onto Maple Street, he noticed a shadowy figure rummaging through a trash bin. It was Joe, a man who had once been a respected factory worker before layoffs swept through the area. Now, he spent his days searching for scraps and muttering to himself about the better days. Michael slowed his bike. He often gave Joe leftover sandwiches from his bag when he could. But today, he had nothing to spare. "Hey, kid," Joe called out, his voice raspy. "Stay out of trouble, you hear? World's got enough problems." Michael nodded, offering a small wave. It was strange advice coming from someone who seemed to carry the world's problems on his back. But Michael tucked the words away, arriving home an hour later. Michael parked his bike by the sagging wooden steps of their duplex. The house was old, its peeling paint and cracked windows standing as silent witnesses to years of hardship. Emily greeted him with a weak smile from the couch, a nebulizer mask over her face. The sound of her strained breathing always gnawed at his heart. "Morning, Mikey," she said, her voice muffled but cheerful. "Did you see Mrs. Brown's cat? She's always on the porch." Michael ruffled her hair, forcing a grin. "Not today, but I'll keep an eye out." "You feeling okay?" Emily nodded but didn't meet his eyes. They both knew the truth later that day. Michael stopped by the corner store to buy bread. The owner, Mr. Patel, was kind enough to let them keep a small tab. But Michael felt the weight of judgmental stares from other customers. A woman in a business suit clutched her purse tighter as he passed, her eyes scanning his ragged clothes with suspicion. He pretended not to notice. But inside, a quiet rage simmered. It wasn't the first time. Michael had grown accustomed to being treated as less than, simply because of where he lived and the color of his skin. The injustices were small but cut deep, like the time the grocery cashier asked if he could actually afford the items in his basket, or when the school principal lectured him about making better choices, without knowing anything about his life. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Michael sat by the window, watching cars pass. He wondered about the people inside. Their lives so different from his own. Did they worry about eviction? Did they wonder if they'd have enough food tomorrow? A part of him longed to escape. But another part, a stronger part, vowed to stay and fight for a better future. Unbeknownst to Michael, this day marked the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he believed about himself and the world. In the shadows of hardship, a spark of hope was waiting to ignite. The next morning came too quickly, bringing with it a damp chill that clung to Michael's clothes as he stepped outside. His bike, as dependable as it was worn, wobbled slightly under the weight of the newspapers he had strapped to its side. The streets were quiet at this hour, the kind of quiet that carried a certain peace, but also the lingering unease of a neighborhood constantly teetering on the edge. Michael's route took him down Elmwood Avenue, where the houses were older but had once been grand. Now, most of them were abandoned, their windows shattered and their front yards overgrown. He pedaled faster here, not out of fear, but because the sight of decay always made his chest tighten. He was deep in thought, calculating how much he could save this week if he skipped lunch, when he saw something unusual. Ahead, on the sidewalk near a stack of freshly cut wood, was an elderly man. His clothes, though clean, were threadbare, and he leaned heavily on a cane as he tried to drag a large log across the yard. The man grunted with effort, his movements slow and labored. It was clear that the task was beyond his strength. Michael hesitated. He was already behind schedule, and he couldn't afford to upset Mr. Grayson again. But something about the man, his stubborn determination despite his obvious frailty, struck a chord. Michael veered off the road and pulled his bike to a stop. "Excuse me, sir," Michael called out, setting his bike against a tree. "Do you need some help?" The man straightened, looking up with a mixture of surprise and relief. His face was weathered, the lines around his eyes speaking to years of hardship. But there was a kindness in his gaze that immediately put Michael at ease. "Well, I won't say no," the man replied, his voice deep but tinged with exhaustion. "These old bones aren't what they used to be." Michael rolled up his sleeves and got to work. The wood was heavier than it looked, but he didn't complain, as he carried piece after piece to the neat pile near the porch. The man watched him closely. "You're a good kid," the man said after a while. "Most people would have just kept walking." Michael shrugged, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's no big deal. You looked like you could use a hand." The man chuckled, though it turned into a brief cough. "The world needs more young folks like you. Name's George, by the way. George Addison." Michael Evans," he replied, setting down another log. As they worked, George told Michael about the house. It had belonged to his late wife's family, and though it was falling apart, he couldn't bring himself to leave it. "Memories," he said simply, his voice heavy with emotion when the last of the wood was stacked. George reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Here," he said, extending it toward Michael. "For your trouble." Michael shook his head firmly. "I don't need any money. Sir, I was just helping." George studied him for a moment, then smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Not many would have done what you did. Son, if you ever need anything, you come find me. You hear?" Michael nodded, thanked him, and hopped back on his bike. As he pedaled away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just met someone important. The small house, the pile of wood, and George's grateful expression stayed with him long after he'd finished his route that night. As Michael sat at the kitchen table working on his homework, his mother came in, her face pale and drawn. She held an envelope in her hands. "What's wrong, Mom?" he asked, setting down his pencil. "It's the electricity bill," Sarah said quietly. "They're threatening to shut it off if we don't pay by next week." Michael's stomach dropped. Emily's nebulizer relied on electricity, and without it, her condition could worsen. He promised himself that he'd find a way to help, even if it meant taking on extra shifts or selling his bike. Little did he know, help was already on its way the following morning. As Michael packed his bag for school, he heard the low rumble of an engine outside. Curious, he peeked through the window. A sleek black Mercedes Maybach had pulled up in front of their house, its polished surface gleaming in the weak morning light. He watched as the driver's door opened, and a man in an expensive suit stepped out. "Michael Evans?" the man called, his voice clear and confident. Michael's heart raced. He glanced at his mother, who stood frozen in the doorway. her hands clutching a dish towel. "What's going on?" she whispered. I don't know," Michael replied, stepping cautiously onto the porch. The man smiled warmly. "My name is Daniel Addison. My father, George, told me about you. He said you helped him yesterday." Michael blinked, confused. "Yes, sir, I just helped him move some wood." Daniel nodded, his expression serious. That act of kindness meant a great deal to him, and to me. "I came to thank you personally." Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "I'd like to offer this as a small token of appreciation. My family believes in rewarding good deeds." Michael hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to refuse. "I appreciate it, but I can't take this," he said, his voice firm. Daniel seemed impressed by the boy's resolve. "Then how about this? I run a company downtown, and we're always looking for hardworking people. Would you consider working part-time in my office?" Michael was stunned. This was more than he had ever imagined. But as he looked back at his mother, her face filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. He knew he had to say yes as Daniel drove away. Michael stood on the porch, the envelope untouched in his hands. He had no idea that this moment would be the beginning of a journey that would change his life forever. Behind him, Emily's laughter filled the air, a rare sound that made him smile. For the first time in a long while, Michael allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The following week, Michael found himself standing in front of the gleaming glass doors of Addison Enterprises, a high-rise that seemed to pierce the clouds. The building's exterior was sleek and modern, a stark contrast to the crumbling structures of Eastside Grove. For a moment, Michael hesitated. He felt out of place, like an intruder in a world he didn't belong to. The lobby was no less intimidating. The floors were polished marble, and the air smelled faintly of expensive cologne. Men and women in tailored suits moved with purpose, their voices low and confident as they carried on important conversations. Michael clutched his second-hand backpack tightly, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor as he approached the receptionist. "Hi, I'm, Michael Evans," he said, his voice faltering. "I'm supposed to start work here today." The receptionist, a sharp-eyed woman with immaculate makeup, glanced at him briefly before pointing to the elevators. "Floor 17. Mr. Addison is expecting you." The elevator ride felt like an eternity. Michael adjusted his collar nervously, his reflection in the mirrored walls reminding him of how out of place he looked in his borrowed shirt and tie. When the doors opened, Daniel Addison was waiting, his smile warm and genuine. "Michael, glad you could make it," Daniel said, extending a hand. His confidence was infectious, and Michael found himself relaxing slightly. "Thank you for this opportunity." "Sir," Michael replied, shaking Daniel's hand firmly. Daniel gestured for him to follow. "No need for formalities. Just call me Daniel. Let me introduce you to someone who will help you get settled." They stopped at a cubicle where a man in his late 20s sat, his desk cluttered with papers and half-empty coffee mugs. His nameplate read Chris Monroe. Chris looked up and grinned, his messy hair and rolled-up sleeves giving him an approachable, laid-back air. "Chris, meet Michael," Daniel said. "He's going to be helping out around here part-time. Make sure he gets the lay of the land." Chris stood and gave Michael an enthusiastic handshake. "Welcome aboard, kid. Don't let the suits scare you. They bark a lot but don't bite." Michael smiled, feeling a flicker of relief. Chris's friendly demeanor made the intimidating environment a little more bearable. Michael's first task was simple: organizing files and delivering documents between departments. It wasn't glamorous, but he threw himself into it with determination. He wanted to prove himself, not just to Daniel and Chris, but to everyone who doubted him. Not everyone was welcoming, though. As Michael carried a stack of files down the hallway, he overheard two employees talking in hushed tones. "Did you hear Daniel hired some charity case? Probably just a PR stunt." Michael froze, the words stinging like a slap. He ducked his head and kept walking, pretending he hadn't heard. But the doubt began to creep in. Did he really belong here? Or was he just a feel-good story for Daniel to tell? When he returned to Chris's desk, his mentor must have sensed his unease. "Hey, you okay?" Chris asked, setting down his coffee. Michael hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just a lot to take in." Chris leaned back in his chair. "Let me tell you something, Michael. People are going to judge you no matter what you do. The trick is proving them wrong. And trust me, you've got what it takes." Over the next few days, Michael began to find his rhythm. Chris was a patient teacher, walking him through the office's routines and systems. He taught Michael how to use the company's database, how to communicate professionally in emails, and even how to tie a proper Windsor knot for his tie. Despite his initial struggles, Michael's natural intelligence and work ethic shone through. He stayed late, double-checking his work and asking questions whenever he didn't understand something. Chris often joked that Michael was more dedicated than half the full-time staff. Still, the learning curve was steep. One afternoon, Michael accidentally misfiled an important document, causing a delay in a project. The department manager, a stern woman named Ms. Caldwell, reprimanded him sharply in front of several employees. "This isn't a playground, young man. If you can't handle the responsibility, maybe you shouldn't be here," she said, her tone icy. Michael's face burned with humiliation, but he refused to let it break him. That evening, he stayed after hours to reorganize the entire filing system, determined to ensure the mistake wouldn't happen again. As the weeks went by, Michael and Chris developed a close bond. Chris wasn't just a mentor, he became a friend. Over lunch breaks, Chris shared stories about his own struggles, how he had worked 3 jobs to put himself through college. "People like us don't get handed anything," Chris said one day, biting into a sandwich. "We have to fight for every inch. But you've got the heart for it, Michael." "I can see that." Michael smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, he began to believe that he might actually have a future here one day. While delivering a stack of reports to Daniel's office, Michael noticed a heated conversation between Daniel and another man. The man, tall and imposing with a sharp suit and a cold expression, was Martin Black, the head of a rival department. Michael only caught fragments of their argument. "This is a mistake, Daniel. You're putting too much faith in people who don't belong here. Everyone deserves a chance. Martin, maybe you should try looking past your own biases." Michael quickly backed away, not wanting to eavesdrop, but the exchange lingered in his mind. It was clear that not everyone in the company shared Daniel's vision of fairness and inclusion. By the end of his first month, Michael had begun to earn the respect of his colleagues. His attention to detail and willingness to learn didn't go unnoticed, and even Ms. Caldwell begrudgingly admitted that his new filing system was efficient. But the true turning point came when Daniel called him into his office one afternoon. "Michael, I've been hearing great things about you," Daniel said, leaning back in his chair. "Chris says you're one of the hardest working people here." Michael felt a swell of pride. "Thank you, sir. I'm just trying to do my best." Daniel smiled. "Keep it up. I have a feeling you're going to do great things." As Michael left the office, he couldn't help but think back to the first day he met George. Helping him had been an instinct, a simple act of kindness. But now, it felt like fate had been guiding him towards something greater. Michael's days at Addison Enterprises began to settle into a routine. He was no longer overwhelmed by the polished offices or the constant buzz of activity. Chris continued to guide him, and Michael's work ethic earned him quiet respect from many of his colleagues. But not everyone was rooting for him. In the shadows of the bustling office, Martin Black, the head of the finance department, was watching Michael closely. Martin, with his crisp suits and icy demeanor, had a reputation for ruthlessness. To him, Michael represented everything Daniel's progressive agenda stood for, and everything Martin despised. One Friday afternoon, Michael was asked to deliver a stack of financial reports to the accounting department. As he handed the papers to Lana, an overworked accountant, she frowned. "Wait a minute," she said, flipping through the pages. "These numbers don't add up." Michael leaned closer, curious. "What do you mean?" Lana pointed to a column of figures. "These projections were finalized last week. Someone's altered them. If this goes to the board, it could cause major issues." Michael felt a jolt of alarm. "Should I tell Mr. Addison?" Lana hesitated, glancing around. "I don't know. Just leave it with me for now." "Okay?" Michael nodded, but the unease lingered. Something about the numbers, and Lana's reaction, didn't sit right with him over the next few days. Michael began to notice strange things happening around the office. Documents would go missing, only to reappear altered. Conversations would abruptly stop when he walked into a room. And then there was Martin, who seemed to be everywhere, his sharp eyes always fixed on Michael. One evening, Michael stayed late to finish organizing files for Chris. As he was packing up, He overheard voices coming from the conference room. Curious, he crept closer. Can't keep covering this up. One voice said. It was Lana. We don't have a choice. Another voice replied, cold and firm. Michael recognized it instantly. It was Martin. If anyone finds out, it's my career on the line. And yours. Michael's heart raced. He backed away quietly, not wanting to be caught. But as he left the office, his mind swirled with questions. What was Martin hiding? And why did Lana seem so afraid? The next morning, Michael found Chris at his desk. His usual laid-back demeanor replaced with a rare seriousness. Chris, can I talk to you? Michael asked, pulling up a chair. Chris nodded, setting down his coffee. What's up? Michael hesitated, then told him everything. Lana's reaction to the altered reports, the suspicious conversations, and the strange behavior he'd noticed around the office. Chris listened intently, his expression darkening with every word. This is bad, Chris said finally. If someone's tampering with financial records, it's more than just unethical. It's illegal. What should we do? Michael asked. Chris leaned back, rubbing his temples. We need proof. Without it, it's just your word against theirs. And trust me, guys like Martin know how to cover their tracks. Days later, the situation escalated. Michael arrived at work to find the office buzzing with whispers. As he reached his desk, Ms. Caldwell stormed toward him, her face a mask of fury. Michael Evans, she snapped. My office. Now. Confused and anxious, Michael followed her. When he entered the office, he was shocked to see Daniel sitting there, his expression unreadable. On the desk in front of them was a file. A file with Michael's name on it. Do you recognize this? Ms. Caldwell demanded, pushing the file toward him. Michael opened it and froze. Inside were falsified financial reports, all bearing his signature. This isn't mine, Michael said quickly, his voice shaking. I didn't do this. Ms. Caldwell crossed her arms. The evidence suggests otherwise. These reports were sent to the board last night, from your login. Michael turned to Daniel, panic rising in his chest. I swear, I didn't do this. Daniel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you, Michael, but this is serious. If we don't find out who's behind this, the consequences could be severe. That evening, Chris found Michael sitting on the steps outside the building, his head in his hands. Hey, kid, Chris said, sitting down beside him. Tough day, huh? Michael looked up, his eyes red. They're framing me, Chris, and I don't know how to prove I didn't do it. Chris patted his shoulder. We'll figure it out, but first, we need to find someone who knows what's going on. Like who? Michael asked bitterly. Chris smirked. Like Lana. The next day, Michael and Chris approached Lana during her lunch break. At first, she was reluctant to talk, her eyes darting nervously around the room. But when Michael explained how he was being framed, she softened. Martin's behind it, she whispered, her voice trembling. He's been embezzling funds for months. And now that things are getting messy, he's looking for a scapegoat. Why me? Michael asked. Because you're new, Lana said, and because you're different. He thinks no one will believe you. Michael clenched his fists, anger and frustration boiling inside him. Can you help me prove it? Lana hesitated, then nodded. I'll try, but if he finds out, he won't, Chris said firmly. We'll make sure of it, with Lana's help. Michael and Chris began gathering evidence. They combed through emails, analyzed documents, and quietly interviewed other employees. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge, one that pointed directly to Martin. But Martin wasn't going down without a fight. One evening, as Michael left the office, he found Martin waiting for him in the parking lot. You're making a big mistake, kid, Martin said, his voice low and threatening. If I were you, I'd drop this, for your own good. Michael's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. I'm not afraid of you. Martin smirked, stepping closer. You should be. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. The weight of everything, his family's struggles, the false accusations, and Martin's threats, pressed heavily on his chest. But as he lay awake, he remembered something Chris had said. People like us don't give up. Michael sat up, determination hardening his resolve. He didn't know how, but he was going to expose Martin and clear his name. The fight was just beginning the next morning. Michael arrived at Addison Enterprises with a new sense of purpose. He was done being scared, done feeling like he didn't belong. If Martin Black thought he could silence him, he was wrong. Still, Michael couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. Martin's words from the night before echoed in his mind. You're making a big mistake. Kid. During his lunch break, Michael decided to visit George Addison. He hadn't seen the elderly man since the day they met, and something told him George might offer some much-needed perspective. George's home was, as Michael remembered, modest, with a cozy warmth that contrasted the cold steel and glass of the office. George greeted him with a grin and a firm handshake, his eyes twinkling with surprise. Michael, what brings you here? Michael hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But as he sat down at the small kitchen table, the words came tumbling out, the falsified reports, the frame job, and Martin's veiled threats. George listened intently, his face growing more serious with every detail. I knew Martin Black would cause trouble one day, George said, his voice low. That man has always cared more about power than people. Michael frowned. You know him? George nodded, leaning back in his chair. Martin's father, Thomas Black, and I were once colleagues, lawyers fighting for civil rights. But Thomas betrayed us. He sold out to powerful corporations, undermining everything we stood for. Martin grew up in that shadow, learning to manipulate and deceive. He's cut from the same cloth. Michael's stomach tightened. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Martin's vendetta wasn't just about him. It was about his connection to George and Daniel, who represented everything Martin sought to destroy, inspired by George's words. Michael returned to the office with renewed determination. Chris and Lana were already waiting for him in the break room, their expressions grim. I found something, Lana said, sliding a folder across the table. These are Martin's personal expense reports. They don't match the official ones submitted to the board. Michael flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. So, he's pocketing money and covering it up? Exactly, Lana replied. But we need more than this to take him down. We need proof that he's behind the altered documents, and that he framed you. Chris leaned forward, his jaw set. I've got an idea. Martin's office has a secure filing cabinet where he keeps hard copies of sensitive documents. If we can get in there. Michael raised an eyebrow. You're suggesting we break into his office? Chris grinned. Not break in, borrow a keycard. Lana, you think you can create a distraction? Lana hesitated but nodded. If it helps clear your name, I'm in. That evening, after most of the staff had gone home, the plan went into motion. Lana approached Martin in the hallway, feigning panic about a supposed IT issue. As Martin left his office to investigate, Chris and Michael slipped inside. Michael's hands shook as he rifled through the filing cabinet. Chris stood guard by the door, his ears tuned for any approaching footsteps. Hurry up, Chris hissed. We've only got a few minutes. Finally, Michael found what they were looking for, a folder labeled Budget Adjustments. Inside were copies of the falsified reports, along with handwritten notes that unmistakably matched Martin's handwriting. Michael's heart raced as he photographed the documents with his phone. Got it, he whispered. Let's go. The next day, Michael, Chris, and Lana presented their findings to Daniel in his office. As Daniel reviewed the evidence, his expression darkened. This is damning, Daniel said, setting the folder down. But if we confront Martin directly, he'll deny everything. We need to take this to the board. Michael hesitated. What if they don't believe us? They will, Daniel said firmly. The truth is on our side. But before they could act, Martin stormed into the office, his face red with anger. What's going on here? He demanded, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Michael and the folder in Daniel's hands. Daniel stood, his calm demeanor unshaken. We know what you've been doing, Martin, and we have the proof. Martin's eyes darted to Michael, his lips curling into a sneer. You think anyone's going to believe this kid? He's nobody. Michael's fists clenched, but Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder, stopping him. This nobody has more integrity than you ever will, Daniel said coldly, and the board will see that. As word of the confrontation spread, the office became a tense battleground. Martin doubled down, using his connections to discredit Michael and his allies. He spread rumors about Michael's background, insinuating that he was only hired as a charity case and wasn't qualified to work at Addison Enterprises. The whispers stung, but Michael refused to let them break him. Instead, he focused on preparing for the upcoming board meeting, where the evidence against Martin would be presented late one night. As Michael worked on his presentation, he received a call from George. I heard about the trouble you're in, George said, I want you to know. No matter what happens, you've made me proud. Michael smiled, the words giving him strength. Thanks, Mr. Addison. I'm going to see this through. For you, for Daniel, and for my family. As he hung up, Michael glanced at the clock. The board meeting was less than 24 hours away. He didn't know what the outcome would be. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going down without a fight the day of the board meeting arrived. And Michael found himself seated in a conference room far larger and more intimidating than he'd imagined. The polished oak table stretched endlessly, and the walls were adorned with framed photos of past CEOs. The board members, a mix of sharp-eyed executives and older, stern-looking individuals, filed in one by one, their expressions unreadable. At the head of the table sat Daniel Addison, his calm demeanor masking the tension in the room. Across from him, Martin Black looked unbothered, his smirk infuriatingly smug. Michael, seated beside Chris and Lana, couldn't help but feel small under the weight of their scrutiny. Let's get started, Daniel said, his voice steady. We're here to discuss allegations of misconduct against Mr. Martin Black. Daniel began by presenting the documents Michael, Chris, and Lana had uncovered. He explained the discrepancies in the financial records and showed how they pointed to embezzlement. Then he played a recording of a conversation between Martin and Lana, where Martin admitted to altering documents and framing Michael. This is absurd, Martin said, leaning back in his chair. You're taking the word of a child and an accountant who's barely competent. If anyone's been tampering with documents, it's them. The accusation made Michael's blood boil. But Daniel spoke before he could. Martin, the evidence speaks for itself. Your handwritten notes are on the altered reports. Martin smirked. Handwritten notes? How do we know those aren't forged? You're willing to ruin my career over some poorly sourced claims? The board members murmured among themselves. And one of them, a middle-aged man in a crisp suit, spoke up. Mr. Addison, while the evidence is compelling, I have to wonder if this is a case of mismanagement rather than malice. Mr. Black has been with the company for years. His record is spotless. Michael felt a surge of frustration. Of course they're defending him. He could see it in their eyes, their willingness to excuse Martin's behavior because of his status and connections. Another board member, an older woman with a sharp gaze, turned to Michael. And what about you, young man? Why should we believe you? You're new here, and frankly, your background doesn't inspire confidence. The words stung, but Michael refused to back down. He met her gaze and said, because the truth doesn't care where I come from. I didn't do this, and I won't let Martin ruin my name to save his. As the meeting continued, Martin's lawyers arrived, armed with their own counter-arguments. They claimed that Michael had tampered with the reports to cover up his own mistakes and accused Daniel of bias for hiring him in the first place. This isn't just about my client's reputation, one lawyer argued. It's about the integrity of this company. Allowing someone with no credentials and no experience to access sensitive documents was a mistake. A mistake Mr. Black is now paying for. Michael clenched his fists under the table, anger surging at the blatant attempt to shift blame. Chris placed a calming hand on his shoulder, whispering, let them dig their own hole. Just when it seemed the tide might turn in Martin's favor, the doors opened, and an unexpected figure walked in, George Addison. The room fell silent as he slowly made his way to the front. Leaning on his cane, Mr. Addison? One of the board members said, surprised. What are you doing here? I'm here because I've seen this kind of injustice before, George said, his voice steady despite his frailty. And I won't sit by while a good man is framed. He turned to Martin, his piercing gaze unwavering. I knew your father, Martin. He was a liar and a cheat. Just like you. You've learned nothing from his mistakes. The room buzzed with murmurs, and Martin's smirk faltered. George continued, addressing the board. This young man, he gestured to Michael, helped me when he had no reason to. He's honest, hardworking, and everything this company should stand for. If you let men like Martin dictate your future, you're signing your own death warrant. George's words seemed to sway some of the board members. But it wasn't enough. Martin's lawyers pressed on, demanding hard evidence to back the claims. That's when Lana stepped forward, holding up a flash drive. I found this on Martin's computer, she said, her voice trembling but firm. It's a log of every transaction he altered. It proves everything. Daniel plugged the flash drive into the projector, displaying a series of spreadsheets and emails that left no doubt about Martin's guilt. The room erupted into chaos as the board members demanded explanations, cornered. Martin finally cracked. Fine, he snapped. Yes, I altered the reports, but I did it for the good of this company. Daniel's reckless policies were driving us into the ground. That's enough, Daniel said, his voice cold. You've done enough damage. Martin, you're fired. Effective immediately. Martin stood, his face red with fury. You'll regret this, Addison, mark my words. As he stormed out, Michael felt a wave of relief. Justice had been served, but he knew this wasn't the end of the fight. After the meeting, Daniel called Michael into his office. You've been through a lot, Daniel said, but you handled yourself with integrity and courage. I'm proud of you. Michael smiled, a weight lifting off his shoulders. Thank you, sir. I just wanted to do what was right. Daniel nodded. And you did. You've earned your place here. Michael, don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. As Michael left the office that day, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. But he also knew that this was just one battle in a larger war. In the distance, the faint sound of sirens reminded him of Eastside Grove and the struggles that still awaited his family. Yet, for the first time, Michael felt like he could face them head-on. He had proven his worth, not just to the company, but to himself. The fallout from Martin Black's downfall left ripples throughout Addison Enterprises. The board implemented stricter policies to prevent future corruption, and Daniel's leadership gained renewed respect. But for Michael, the battle had been a transformative experience. He was no longer the unsure boy who had started a part-time job with borrowed clothes and shaky confidence. He had proven that integrity and determination could hold their own in a world that often rewarded the opposite. A week after the board meeting, Daniel called Michael into his office. As Michael sat down, he couldn't help but notice the faint smile tugging at the corners of Daniel's usually composed expression. You've done well, Michael, Daniel began. Not many people could have handled the pressure you faced, and come out stronger for it. I want to offer you a new role here. One with more responsibility. Michael blinked, surprised. A new role? Like what? Daniel handed him a sheet of paper outlining a junior administrative assistant position. The role involved managing schedules, coordinating small projects, and even assisting with community outreach initiatives. It wasn't just a promotion, it was a chance to make a real impact. I trust you, Daniel said, and I think you'll bring a fresh perspective to this company. Michael's heart swelled with pride. I won't let you down. Sir, I know you won't, Daniel replied. With his new position, Michael's schedule became busier than ever. He spent his mornings organizing meetings and handling paperwork and his afternoons assisting Chris with larger projects. But despite the demands of his job, Michael never forgot his responsibilities at home. His mother, Sarah, noticed the change in him. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table going over bills, she said, "You've grown up so much these past few months. Michael, I don't know what we'd do without you." Michael smiled, but the weight of her words wasn't lost on him. The bills were still overwhelming, and Emily's medical needs continued to strain their finances. Despite his growing success at work, the reality of their struggles loomed large as part of his new role. Michael began working on a community outreach program aimed at supporting underserved neighborhoods like Eastside Grove. The program involved scholarships, job training, and local business partnerships. For Michael, this wasn't just work, it was personal. One afternoon, Michael met with local leaders to discuss potential initiatives. Among them was Mrs. Thompson, the owner of a struggling grocery store that had been a staple in the community for decades. "We've been barely holding on," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice heavy with emotion. "If something doesn't change soon, we'll have to close." Michael took her concerns back to the office and pitched a plan to Daniel. Addison Enterprises would sponsor local businesses in exchange for community-based partnerships. To his relief, Daniel approved the idea, and soon, the program was underway. Watching businesses like Mrs. Thompson's thrive again gave Michael a sense of pride he hadn't felt before. It wasn't just about success, it was about giving back. Not everything was smooth sailing. One of Michael's first solo projects, a presentation for a potential investor, nearly fell apart when a key report was delayed. The stress was overwhelming, and Michael found himself questioning whether he was truly capable of handling his new responsibilities. Chris noticed Michael's struggle and pulled him aside. "You're putting too much pressure on yourself. Kid, no one expects you to be perfect. But I don't want to let anyone down. Michael admitted. You won't, Chris said. Just remember, you don't have to do everything alone. Lean on the people around you. That's what teamwork is all about. Michael took Chris's advice to heart. With help from his colleagues, he salvaged the presentation, and the investor was impressed. It was a valuable lesson in collaboration and resilience. Just as things seemed to be settling down, a new challenge emerged. A former associate of Martin's, Evan Harper, began spreading rumors about Addison Enterprises, claiming that the company's outreach programs were a cover for unethical practices. The accusations gained traction, and soon, the media was involved. Michael, now deeply invested in the outreach initiatives, took the rumors personally. This is ridiculous, he said during a team meeting. We're actually helping people. How can anyone believe these lies? Daniel's expression was grim. We'll need to address this head-on. Transparency is key. Michael volunteered to organize a press conference to showcase the success stories from their outreach program. With Chris's help, he gathered testimonials from local business owners and families who had benefited from the initiatives. The press conference was a nerve-wracking experience for Michael. Standing in front of a room full of journalists and cameras, he felt the weight of every eye on him. But as he spoke about the impact of the outreach program, his nerves gave way to passion. We're not just a company, Michael said, his voice steady. We're part of this community. And when the community thrives, we all thrive. His words were met with applause, and several journalists approached him afterward for interviews. The rumors began to lose credibility, and public support for Addison Enterprises grew despite the challenges. Michael found himself growing more confident and capable with each passing day. His family noticed the change, too. Emily, who had always looked up to her brother, began talking about her own dreams of becoming a doctor one day. You're my inspiration, Mikey, she said one evening. If you can make a difference, so can I. Michael's eyes misted with pride. You can do anything, Em, and I'll be here every step of the way. As Michael's star continued to rise, he couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. He knew the road wouldn't be easy, there would always be new obstacles to overcome. But for the first time, he felt ready to face them. Looking out over the city from his modest office, Michael thought of George's words. The world needs more people like you. He didn't know if he could live up to that, but he was determined to try. The newfound stability at Addison Enterprises brought with it a sense of optimism. But the peace was short-lived. Just as Michael was beginning to feel at home in his role, a new storm was brewing, one that would test his resolve and uncover dark truths hidden beneath the surface. The weeks following the scholarship reform should have been a time of celebration. But the victory came with consequences. While the community's support for Addison Enterprises grew, powerful individuals and organizations that had benefited from the previous system began to push back. The battle Michael thought he had won was only the beginning. One morning, Daniel called an emergency meeting. Michael, Chris, and a handful of senior staff gathered in the conference room. Their expressions tense. We've been served, Daniel announced, tossing a thick envelope onto the table. A group of former business partners is suing us for breach of contract and defamation. Michael's stomach sank. What does this mean for the company? Daniel sighed. It means a long and expensive legal battle. They're accusing us of sabotaging their reputations with the community. If they win, it could bankrupt us. Chris leaned forward, his voice sharp. This is retaliation. They want to scare us into backing down. They won't succeed, Daniel said firmly, but we need to be prepared. This fight is going to get ugly. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the company. Employees worried about their job security, and investors began to pull out, citing concerns about the company's stability. The media latched onto the story, framing it as a battle between a scrappy local business and a coalition of powerful corporations. Michael found himself at the center of the storm. Journalists camped outside his family's home, eager for a quote from the young man who had played a pivotal role in the company's reforms. The attention made him uncomfortable, but he refused to let it deter him. At home, the stress took its toll on Sarah. Michael, maybe you should step back, she said one evening as they watched a news report about the lawsuit. This is too much for you to handle. Michael shook his head. I can't, Mom. If we back down now, everything we fought for will be lost. Sarah sighed, her worry etched into her face. Just promise me you'll take care of yourself. As the legal battle unfolded, Daniel brought in a legal consultant, Rebecca Hayes, a seasoned attorney with a reputation for taking on impossible cases. Rebecca was sharp, no nonsense, and unafraid to challenge even the most powerful opponents. At their first meeting, Rebecca turned to Michael. "You're the heart of this case. The community sees you as a symbol of what Addison Enterprises stands for. But that also makes you a target." Michael nodded. "I'm ready." Rebecca's gaze softened slightly. "Good, because we're going to need your testimony." The trial began with opening statements that painted vastly different pictures of Addison Enterprises. The plaintiff's attorneys described the company as reckless and manipulative, while Rebecca framed it as a force for good, standing up to unethical practices. When it was Michael's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. Dressed in his best suit, he spoke about his experiences growing up in Eastside Grove, his journey at Addison Enterprises, and his belief in the company's mission. "This isn't just about contracts or money," Michael said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "It's about giving people like me a real chance, to succeed." The opposing attorney tried to rattle him, questioning his qualifications and motivations. "Isn't it true that you've personally benefited from these reforms?" Michael met the lawyer's gaze. "Yes, I have, but so have countless others. This isn't about me, it's about fairness." As the trial continued, Michael began noticing strange things. His laptop froze during important tasks, and anonymous emails warned him to stay out of it. One evening, as he left the office, he found his bike's tires slashed. Chris insisted on driving Michael home that night. "They're trying to intimidate you," Chris said. "Don't let them win." Michael nodded, but the threats weighed heavily on him. He began to question whether his involvement was putting his family in danger. In the middle of the trial, Lana uncovered a crucial piece of evidence, an internal memo from one of the plaintiff's companies that outlined their predatory practices and explicitly targeted low-income communities. The memo also mentioned collusion with Martin Black, tying the lawsuit to the earlier corruption scandal. Rebecca presented the memo in court, and the plaintiff's case began to unravel. The judge ordered an investigation into the company's practices, shifting public opinion firmly in Addison Enterprises' favor. When the verdict was finally delivered, Michael held his breath. The judge ruled in favor of Addison Enterprises, dismissing the plaintiff's claims and ordering them to pay damages for their unethical behavior. The courtroom erupted in applause, and Michael felt an overwhelming wave of relief. Rebecca shook his hand, her usual stern demeanor softening. "You did good, kid," she said. Daniel placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. "You've proven yourself time and time again. I couldn't be prouder." That evening, Michael returned to Eastside Grove. As he walked through the familiar streets, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight had been grueling, but it had shown him the power of resilience and integrity. At home, Emily ran to him, her face lighting up with joy. "Mikey, you did it." Michael hugged her tightly. "We did it, and we're just getting started." The victory opened new doors for Michael. Community leaders approached him with ideas for further outreach programs, and local students began looking up to him as a role model. But Michael knew the journey wasn't over. "There's still so much to do," he told Chris one afternoon as they discussed their next project. "But now, I know we can handle whatever comes our way." Chris grinned. "That's the spirit, kid." In the wake of the lawsuit victory, Addison Enterprises stood stronger than ever. Public opinion shifted in their favor, and the community saw the company as a champion for fairness and opportunity. For Michael, the experience was transformative. He had grown from a hesitant newcomer into a respected voice within the company, a leader who understood the stakes and the struggles of those he represented. One morning, Daniel called Michael into his office. The atmosphere was lighter than it had been in months, and for the first time, Daniel seemed relaxed. "Michael," he began, leaning back in his chair, "we've been through a lot together, and I've seen firsthand the kind of impact you're capable of making. I'd like to offer you a leadership position." Michael's eyes widened. "A leadership position? What kind?" Daniel handed him a folder. Inside was a proposal for a community impact coordinator role. The position involved overseeing all outreach programs, building partnerships with local organizations, and mentoring new interns. "You'd be perfect for this," Daniel said. "You understand these communities better than anyone else here. And more importantly, you care." Michael hesitated. The opportunity was incredible, but it came with immense responsibility. Are you sure I'm ready for this? Daniel smiled. You've already proven you're ready. The question is, do you believe in yourself? Michael took a deep breath and nodded. I'll do it. The new role demanded long hours and constant decision-making, but Michael approached it with the same determination that had brought him this far. He spent his days coordinating events, meeting with community leaders, and mentoring young interns, many of whom came from similar backgrounds. But the workload began to take its toll. At home, Sarah noticed how often Michael came home late. His shoulders slumped with exhaustion. One evening, as they sat in the kitchen, she said, "Mikey, you've been working so hard. Don't forget to take care of yourself." Michael smiled faintly. "I'm fine, Mom. Really, this is important." Sarah placed a hand on his. "I know it is, but you're important, too." As Michael's responsibilities grew, so did the demands on his time. He had to make difficult choices, often missing family dinners or Emily's school events. One night, as he prepared for a major presentation, Emily knocked on his door. "Hey, Mikey," she said, holding up a drawing. "I made this for you." The picture showed Michael standing in front of a group of children, holding a book. Above him, Emily had written in big, colorful letters, "My hero." Michael's throat tightened. "Thanks, Em. I love it. Will you come to my play tomorrow?" she asked, her eyes hopeful. Michael hesitated. He had a critical meeting scheduled at the same time. "I'll try," he said, knowing he probably wouldn't make it. The disappointment on Emily's face was subtle but unmistakable. Michael carried the guilt with him as he worked late into the night. Despite the personal sacrifices, Michael's work began to bear fruit. The outreach programs expanded, offering scholarships, job training, and financial literacy workshops. Local businesses partnered with Addison Enterprises to create internships and mentorship opportunities for underserved youth. One day, during a community event, a young boy approached Michael. "Are you Mr. Evans?" he asked shyly. Michael crouched down to his level. "That's me. What's your name?" "Jamal," the boy said. "I got one of your scholarships. I'm going to college because of you." Michael smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You earned it, Jamal. Just keep working hard." Moments like these reminded Michael why he had chosen this path. It wasn't just about fixing systems, it was about changing lives. Just as things seemed to be stabilizing, a new challenge emerged. An influential investor, Robert Harrington, began pushing for changes that prioritized profit over community impact. Harrington argued that the outreach programs were draining resources and insisted on scaling them back. During a tense board meeting, Harrington said, "We're running a business, not a charity. If we don't focus on the bottom line, we'll lose everything." Michael couldn't stay silent. "These programs are the reason we've regained the community's trust. Cutting them now would undo all the progress we've made." Harrington smirked, spoken like someone who doesn't understand how businesses work. Daniel intervened. "Michael understands more than you think. Robert, these programs are an investment in our future, and they're non-negotiable." The conflict set the stage for a larger battle over the company's direction, with Michael and Daniel fighting to protect the heart of Addison Enterprises. One evening, after another long day, Michael found himself sitting on the steps of the old duplex in Eastside Grove. The neighborhood was as rough as ever, but for the first time, he felt a sense of hope. He thought about everything he had been through, helping George, exposing Martin, and standing up to powerful opponents. George's words echoed in his mind. "The world needs more people like you." Michael didn't know if he could live up to that, but he was determined to try. Emily joined him on the steps, her presence grounding him. "You're doing good things, Mikey," she said softly, "even if you miss a few plays." Michael smiled, ruffling her hair. "Thanks, Em. That means a lot." As Michael prepared for the next phase of his journey, he knew the stakes were higher than ever. Protecting the company's mission would require more than just hard work, it would demand courage, resilience, and the unwavering belief that one person could make a difference. The battle for Addison Enterprises wasn't over, but Michael was ready for whatever came next. Michael knew the upcoming board meeting would be a turning point for Addison Enterprises. Robert Harrington, the influential investor who had been pushing to scale back the community outreach programs, was rallying support from other stakeholders. His message was simple but dangerous: prioritize profits or risk losing everything. Michael, Daniel, and their allies in the company worked tirelessly to counter Harrington's narrative. But as the meeting drew closer, the tension mounted. If Harrington succeeded, everything Michael had fought for would be undone. The night before the meeting, Michael was reviewing documents in his office when Lana knocked on the door. Her face pale. "I found something," she said, placing a folder on his desk. "You're going to want to see this." Michael opened the folder and scanned the contents. His heart raced as the pieces fell into place. The documents revealed a secret partnership Harrington had with one of the predatory companies Addison Enterprises had severed ties with during the lawsuit. The partnership stood to make Harrington millions, but only if the outreach programs were dismantled. "This is it," Michael said, his voice steady. "This proves he's not acting in the company's best interests." The atmosphere in the boardroom the next morning was electric. Harrington sat at the head of the table, exuding confidence, while Daniel and Michael prepared for a fight. The other board members were divided, some clearly aligned with Harrington, others undecided. Harrington opened the meeting with a sharp critique of the outreach programs. "While these initiatives are well-meaning," he said, "they're unsustainable. If we want Addison Enterprises to survive, we must focus on profitability." Michael stood, his heart pounding but his voice firm. "With all due respect, Mr. Harrington, you're wrong. These programs are the reason our company is thriving. They've rebuilt trust with the community, strengthened our brand, and created long-term value." Harrington smirked. "That's a nice sentiment, Mr. Evans, but sentiment doesn't pay the bills." Michael glanced at Daniel, who nodded in encouragement. Taking a deep breath, Michael placed the folder Lana had given him on the table. "Sentiment doesn't pay the bills, but integrity does, and this company deserves leaders who prioritize both." He opened the folder and began presenting the evidence of Harrington's secret partnership. The room fell silent as the board members realized the implications. "This isn't about sustainability," Michael continued. "It's about greed. Mr. Harrington stands to profit if these programs are cut, regardless of the damage it would do to Addison Enterprises." Harrington's face darkened. "This is a baseless attack. You have no proof." Daniel leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "The documents don't lie, Robert, and neither do your actions." The confrontation reached its climax as the board called for a vote. The question was simple: continue the outreach programs and maintain Addison Enterprises' mission, or scale them back to prioritize short-term profits. One by one, the board members cast their votes. Michael's heart pounded as the tally grew closer. Finally, the last vote was cast, and the results were clear. The outreach programs would remain. Harrington stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You'll regret this," he spat before storming out of the room. As the doors closed behind him, a wave of relief washed over Michael. The programs were safe, for now. After the meeting, Daniel pulled Michael aside. "You were incredible in there," he said. "You've proven yourself time and time again, and I couldn't be prouder." Michael smiled, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He knew the victory was important, but it felt like just one step in a much larger journey. That evening, the company held a small celebration for the team. As Michael stood among his colleagues, he thought of the people who had supported him: George, Chris, Lana, Daniel, and his family. Their belief in him had carried him through the toughest moments. A few days later, Michael received a call from George. "I've been hearing about everything you've done," George said. "You've made me proud, Michael, and I want to help." That afternoon, George visited the office with a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter announcing a significant donation to the company's outreach programs, ensuring their sustainability for years to come. Michael hugged the older man, his gratitude overwhelming. "Thank you, George, for everything." George smiled. "You've done the hard work, son. This is just my way of saying I believe in you." The victory at Addison Enterprises had far-reaching consequences. The community outreach programs expanded, helping thousands of families access education, job training, and financial support. Michael became a mentor to many of the students in the scholarship program, sharing his story and inspiring them to pursue their dreams. Emily, now more confident than ever, excelled in school and began preparing for college. "You're my role model, Mikey," she told him one evening. "You've shown me that anything's possible." As Michael walked through Eastside Grove one evening, he reflected on how far he had come. The streets were still rough, but there were signs of hope: new businesses opening, kids playing in newly renovated parks, and neighbors banding together to improve their community. Standing on the steps of the duplex, Michael felt a deep sense of purpose. He wasn't just working for Addison Enterprises. He was working for the people who had been overlooked for too long. The fight wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. The world around Michael had changed drastically since that fateful day he stopped to help George with a pile of wood. Addison Enterprises was now a symbol of resilience and fairness, and Michael had become a key figure in its transformation. But more importantly, Michael had found a purpose that extended beyond himself, a mission to uplift others who faced the same struggles he had. One crisp Saturday morning, Michael returned to Eastside Grove Community Center, a place he hadn't visited in years. The center was newly renovated, funded by Addison Enterprises outreach programs. The smell of fresh paint lingered in the air, and children's laughter echoed through the halls. As he walked through the building, he passed a group of young students huddled around a table, excitedly sharing their dreams. One of them, a boy with wide eyes and a bright smile, looked up and waved. "You're Michael Evans, right?" the boy asked. "The guy from TV?" Michael chuckled. "That's me. What's your name?" "Jordan," the boy said. "I got one of your scholarships. I want to be an engineer someday." Michael knelt beside him. "That's a great goal, Jordan. Keep working hard, and you'll get there." The boy's enthusiasm reminded Michael of his younger self, full of hope despite the odds. It was moments like these that made everything worth it. Later that day, Michael visited George at his home. The old man was sitting on the porch, a blanket draped over his legs and a steaming cup of tea in his hands. "Ah, Michael," George said with a warm smile. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I wanted to thank you," Michael said, sitting beside him, "for everything you've done for me. None of this would have happened without you." George chuckled. "All I did was accept your kindness, son. The rest was all you." Michael reached into his bag and pulled out a plaque. It read, "In honor of George Addison, for inspiring generations to lead with integrity and compassion. We're dedicating the community center in your name," Michael said. George's eyes glistened with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll come to the ribbon-cutting ceremony," Michael said with a grin. George nodded. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The day of the dedication ceremony arrived, and the community center was filled with families, local leaders, and Addison Enterprises employees. Michael stood on stage, looking out at the crowd. Among them were his mother, Sarah, and Emily, who waved proudly from the front row. Michael's speech was heartfelt. "This center isn't just a building. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together. It's a reminder that no matter where we come from, we all deserve a chance to succeed." He turned to George, seated beside Daniel, "And it's named after the man who taught me the importance of kindness and integrity. George, this is for you." The crowd erupted into applause as George stood, his face glowing with pride. That evening, as the family celebrated at home, Emily pulled Michael aside. "I have something to tell you," she said, her eyes shining. "What's up?" Michael asked. "I got accepted into the pre-med program at State University," Emily said, grinning. Michael's jaw dropped. That's amazing. I'm so proud of you." "It's because of you, Mikey," she said. "You've always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Michael hugged her tightly. "You're going to do great things." I know it." Just as things seemed to be settling into place, a new challenge emerged. A powerful real estate developer announced plans to buy up large portions of Eastside Grove for luxury apartments, threatening to displace hundreds of families. The community turned to Michael for help. "You've fought for us before," Mrs. Thompson, the grocery store owner, said. "We need you now more than ever." Michael partnered with Addison Enterprises to launch a campaign against the development, emphasizing the importance of preserving the neighborhood's identity and protecting its residents. The fight was grueling, but Michael's persistence paid off. The developer eventually withdrew their plans, and Eastside Grove was declared a protected area. With the crisis averted, Michael took a moment to reflect. He stood on a hill overlooking Eastside Grove, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the rooftops. The neighborhood was far from perfect, but it was thriving in ways he had never imagined. Chris joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thinking about the next big challenge?" he asked. Michael smiled. "Always. You've come a long way, kid," Chris said. "I hope you're proud of yourself." "I am," Michael replied. But there's still so much to do. As the years passed, Michael continued to dedicate himself to improving lives through Addison Enterprises and his work in the community. He became a mentor to countless young people, always reminding them of the power of resilience, kindness, and hard work. At the heart of it all was the lesson George had taught him. Even the smallest act of kindness can change a life. And sometimes, it can change the world. Decades later, a young boy stood on the steps of the community center, looking up at the plaque dedicated to George Addison. Beside it was a new one, honoring Michael Evans for his lifelong commitment to justice and opportunity. The boy turned to his mother. "Who is Michael Evans?" She smiled. "He was someone who believed in people, even when no one else did. And because of him, we have this center." The boy's eyes sparkled with determination. "I want to be like him someday." And so, the legacy of kindness continued.